Hi everyone, Joe Kral with the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to Pro-Life University. I hope you've been enjoying our weekly discussions, our weekly videos, and if you haven't already, please sign up and subscribe. Always give us a big thumbs up for our efforts here. And again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to comment in the comment section below. One of the things that we always advocate here, and especially me as someone who is a pro-life public policy expert, is I always encourage the pro-life advocate to get to know more. And the reason why I promote such a philosophy, if you will, is because I understand that the more you know as an advocate, the stronger your argument becomes. So we want our pro-life advocates to be as strong as possible in their arguments when they're arguing for the establishment of a culture of life. Well, this week's topic, we're going to discuss what's called wrongful birth lawsuits and the need to ban wrongful birth lawsuits. In many ways, legislation that would prohibit or ban wrongful birth lawsuits goes hand in hand with legislation that we've been seeing, like we've seen this in Pennsylvania as well, and in other states. Indiana being another example, where they've passed what's called the Prenatal Non-Discrimination Act, where you would be prohibited from aborting a child that because of race, gender, or disability. Banning wrongful birth lawsuits falls into many of the same sort of arguments that we'll be discussing here today. So in many ways, they go hand in hand with respect to showing respect for the unborn for many of the same reasons. Now, let's talk a little bit about wrongful birth lawsuits. The name, as it suggests, is that somehow a child has been born wrongfully. A child should have never been born. And typically what happens in these lawsuits is we see parents bring these lawsuits where a child has been born disabled, either from a genetic disability such as Down syndrome, or some other genetic disability. But nonetheless, what we see here is a parent brings a lawsuit because they argue that if they had known that their child was going to be born with a disability, they would have never had the child to begin with. And this is really kind of a sad state, if you really think about it, a sad state in which our culture has kind of come to, that essentially it's basically stating in these states that permit wrongful birth lawsuits that some life isn't worth even being born. And that's really kind of a sad sort of thing. We as pro-lifers certainly do not recognize that sort of thing. We recognize that all life is valuable, that all life is dignified, all human life is dignified, and all human life ought to be protected. Now, again, in many ways, we are seeing a form of eugenics here. And this is one of the reasons, and this actually kind of gets into the Prenatal Non-Discrimination Acts, why various states are trying to pass that and why we're seeing organizations try to push it, is because you really have this sort of eugenics idea when it comes to aborting those that aren't genetically healthy, if you will. So, for example, we could look at Iceland. Iceland is a good example where virtually there's no one there born with Down syndrome anymore. Why? Because there's intense societal pressure to abort those children. Recently, if we want to look at wrongful birth lawsuits, there was just a recent article this past week in lifenews.com where a mother was awarded a substantial sum of money for her child that was born with Down syndrome. Again, we're dealing with something really odd here. Again, this idea that somehow people aren't worth being born. And again, in many ways, what we see here is a form of selfishness, if you will. And a selfishness that, these people don't want to take on the burdens that are required of them. Right? In many ways, this gets into the very notion of what justice is, the virtue of justice. And when we classically look at justice, and we look at the classic definition of justice, we can come to know a little bit more about why we pursue the pro-life legislation that we do, especially in this area. So when we look at the definition, the classical definition of justice, which is classically defined as that which is owed or due to another. Right? One of the things that we need to keep in mind is when we talk about this virtue or this concept of justice is that it's about the other. It's about the other person. It focuses on the other. Being just is about being selfless, if you will. It's not about being selfish. So these parents that don't want to take on the responsibilities as a parent, in many ways are being unjust to their own unborn children or to their own unborn child. I mean, imagine, what are you saying as a parent if you have a child that is disabled, you file a lawsuit saying that they were wrongfully born? You're basically telling that child, you may not be saying it in these kind of direct words, but you're certainly subconsciously telling this child, you shouldn't have been born. You should have been killed through abortion. That's tragic. That's sad. That's horrifying. Right? And that's wrong on top of it. It's morally repugnant. Parents have a duty to their offspring. That's one of the things that we need to recognize. We certainly recognize this ethically speaking. Certainly from a scriptural standpoint, we see the duties that a family has towards their children, the parents have towards their children. And we even see to some extent duties that children have towards their parents. But nonetheless, when we talk about this particular sort of thing, one of the things that we need to realize is that there is no moral duty of the child to not be a burden for their parents. There's no such moral duty that exists. The duty does, however, fall upon the parent to always care for the child, whether that child is healthy, whether that child is disabled. The duty falls on the parent to be responsible for the upbringing and the care of that child, no matter what the condition is. Why? Because that child is a human being that has dignity and deserves respect. And, again, just like any other human being, deserves to have justice. And so the parents owe a duty of responsibility to this child. Now, one of the things that we also need to briefly talk about is what happens. Now, they're roughly what happens when it comes to states that have the ability where someone can file a wrongful birth lawsuit. Roughly right now, I believe there's about 22 states that outlaw or prohibit wrongful birth lawsuits. And that's good, but that definitely means there's 28 other states out there that need to ban these sorts of things. Now, in many cases, we can see why some doctors might be overzealous in trying to diagnose potential problems with the unborn child. They don't want to be sued. And so in some cases, you might get doctors who are overzealous in their diagnosis. The unborn child is then aborted, but in all honesty, the unborn child might not have had the problem to begin with. It's only the overzealousness of the doctor that really causes this unborn child to be aborted, and that's wrong. One of the things that we've got to understand is not every test that happens for the unborn child is going to dictate with absolute 100% certainty that a child might be, for example, born with Down syndrome. And so one of the things that we need to understand as a society is not only are we trying to help inform the parents that, that every life is sacred, but we're trying to help doctors here too. And to some extent, we're trying to help doctors practice medicine in a proper ethical sort of way. We all understand the Hippocratic Oath, and we all understand one of the first principles that comes out of the Hippocratic Oath: do no harm. And that's an important sort of principle here. Doctors don't need to cause harm. Now, when we look at the Hippocratic Oath and we look at this word harm, one of the things that we fundamentally need to understand is that the oath is not just talking about physical harm. It's not that the doctor isn't to cause physical harm to the patient. He's definitely not supposed to do that. But it's also meant to show a respect for life. In many respects, doctors have to treat mother and child as patients, right, in the plural, right? And they've got to recognize that they have a duty not only they have a duty to the mother, but they also have a duty to the child. But that they have to respect life in all of its stages as well. And part of that respect for life is helping protect that life. And, helping people if there is a possibility that a child may be born with a disability, helping prepare those parents to properly live with the child, giving them the information they need, maybe pointing them in the right direction with folks that may be able to help them out, support groups and so forth, or even just general care that can help them. But that's mainly a doctor's responsibility. It's not necessarily to advise them that, well, you might want to consider an abortion. That's definitely wrong. We don't want to go in that direction. And in this respect, prohibiting wrongful birth lawsuits helps restore the proper order of medicine and helping recognize that the doctor has a duty to mother and child. It's a child that's being born. It's a child that's developing inside the womb. And so the doctor has a responsibility, a moral responsibility to help care for that child. And again, that gets into the idea of justice as well. Why? Because that's what's due to the child. Just as much as the mother might need to get checkups and see that she's healthy and okay, the doctor's got to make sure that the life of that child is okay too, and that it's protected, and they're doing things to bring about the birth of this child. And again, it's just very, very important to fundamentally realize how these sorts of prohibitions, if you will, in those states that have prohibited wrongful birth lawsuits, that it shows an ultimate respect for all life. And that's an important concept, all life. Think about that. That shows respect for not only the healthy life, but those that may be born with disabilities, those that may be born with Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis or any number of disabilities that are out there. When we look at it, and we can certainly look at it from a scriptural standpoint, but when we look at it from a theological standpoint, we realize that all of us are made in the image of God, and all of us need to respect that. And as Christians, we certainly need to respect that. And even the person that has a disability is made in the image and likeness of God. God created that person, and that we need to respect that person and treat them as a person. And I think when we have laws or enact laws that prohibit wrongful birth lawsuits, we are certainly looking to respect the human person, especially the child that may be disabled, showing that they are wanted, that they are needed, that they are appreciated in society. Again, thank you so much, guys. We appreciate everything that you do. If you have any questions, again, just ask in the comments down below. And again, if you can, be sure to share with your friends. We appreciate everything that you do to help establish a culture of life. Have a wonderful weekend, and God bless.